The transport truck bounced violently along the dirt road, its metal floor cold against Maya's bruised knees. Her wrists were bound behind her back with rough rope that cut into her skin with every jolt. Around her, 12 other prisoners sat in similar positions, their faces marked by fear, exhaustion, and resignation. The smell of sweat and diesel fumes filled the cramped space as armed guards watched them with suspicious eyes. Maya kept her head down, letting her long black hair fall like a curtain across her face. She had learned long ago that drawing attention meant inviting trouble. The guards saw her as just another rebel they had captured during the raid on the mountain village. They had no idea who she really was, and she intended to keep it that way. The truck hit another pothole, sending several prisoners tumbling into each other. One of the guards laughed cruelly and made a joke about how the rebels would learn real discipline soon enough. Maya bit her tongue to keep from responding. She had spent years learning to control her temper, to hide the fire that burned inside her. It was a skill that had kept her alive through countless dangerous situations. Commander Thorne sat in the front passenger seat, occasionally glancing back at the prisoners through a small window. He was a tall man with graying hair and cold blue eyes that missed nothing. His uniform was perfectly pressed despite the long journey, and his boots gleamed even in the dim light of the truck. The other soldiers clearly feared and respected him in equal measure. Maya had heard stories about Thorne long before today. He was known throughout the territory as a man who showed no mercy to those who opposed the government. His methods were brutal but effective, and he had crushed dozens of rebel groups over the years. Many brave fighters had simply vanished after falling into his hands, never to be seen again. The truck began to slow as they approached their destination. Through the small barred windows, Maya could see high concrete walls topped with razor wires stretching into the distance. Watchtowers loomed at regular intervals, their searchlights already beginning to sweep the grounds even though darkness had not yet fallen. This was Blackstone Prison, a place where hope went to die. As the massive steel gates slowly opened to admit them, Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. She had known this day might come when she chose to fight alongside the resistance movement. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it were two very different things. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in like a heavy stone settling in her stomach. The truck came to a stop in a concrete courtyard surrounded by more walls and guards. Maya could hear dogs barking somewhere in the distance, and the air carried the sound of machinery and shouted orders. This place was designed to break people down, to strip away everything that made them human until only obedience remained. Commander Thorne climbed down from the truck and spoke briefly with the prison warden, a heavy-set man whose belly strained against his uniform buttons. They exchanged documents and discussed procedures while the prisoners waited in growing anxiety. Maya caught fragments of their conversation about processing schedules and security protocols, but most of it was lost in the echo of the courtyard walls. The rear doors of the truck were thrown open with a loud clang, and harsh artificial light flooded in. Guards immediately began shouting orders for the prisoners to move quickly and stay in line. Anyone who hesitated or stumbled was roughly pushed forward. Maya shuffled along with the others, keeping her eyes fixed on the ground while taking careful note of everything around her. They were herded through a series of heavy doors and metal detectors into what appeared to be a processing area. The walls were painted an institutional green that had faded and chipped over the years. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly pale glow that made everyone look half dead already. A guard with sergeant stripes on his sleeve read from a clipboard in a bored monotone. He explained that they would be searched, photographed, and assigned prisoner numbers. Personal belongings would be confiscated and stored until their release, though he made it clear that release was not something they should expect anytime soon. Several of the younger prisoners began to cry softly at this news. Maya was directed into a smaller room where a female guard waited with latex gloves and a metal detector wand. The woman had short brown hair and tired eyes that suggested she had been doing this job for far too long. She gestured for Maya to stand against the wall and spread her arms wide while she began the search procedure. The guard worked methodically, checking Maya's pockets and patting down her clothes for hidden weapons or contraband. She found nothing interesting except for a small silver locket that Maya wore around her neck. The guard held it up to the light and examined it briefly before deciding it was harmless jewelry that could be returned later. Meanwhile, other prisoners were going through similar procedures in adjacent rooms. Maya could hear the shuffle of feet, the snap of latex gloves, and occasional protests when someone objected to the invasive nature of the search. The guards handled all complaints with the same cold efficiency, making it clear that cooperation was not optional. Commander Thorne appeared in the doorway of Maya's search room, his presence immediately commanding attention. Even the experienced female guard seemed to straighten up and work more carefully under his watchful gaze. He studied Maya's face as if trying to memorize every detail, which made her extremely uncomfortable. The search continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. Maya was photographed from multiple angles, fingerprinted, and given a prisoner uniform that was too large for her small frame. The gray fabric was rough and smelled strongly of industrial disinfectant, but at least it was clean. Her own clothes were placed in a plastic bag with her prisoner number written on it in black marker. As the initial processing neared completion, Maya began to hope that the worst was over for now. She had managed to get through the search without revealing anything that would compromise her true identity. Her cover story about being a village teacher who had been helping the rebels with supplies seemed to be holding up under casual scrutiny. But her relief was premature. As she was being led toward what she assumed would be her cell block, Commander Thorne suddenly spoke up from across the room. His voice carried clearly over the noise of ongoing processing activities, and every guard in the area immediately stopped what they were doing to listen. He ordered that all the new prisoners be subjected to a complete strip search before being assigned to their permanent housing. This was apparently not standard procedure, because several guards exchanged surprised glances before quickly moving to comply. Maya felt her heart begin to race as she realized what this meant for her carefully guarded secret. The female guard who had searched her earlier looked apologetic but gestured for Maya to remove all of her clothing. Around the room, other prisoners were receiving similar orders with varying degrees of resistance and humiliation. Some complied immediately, while others had to be physically encouraged by additional guards who were called in to assist. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she began to unbutton the prison uniform she had just put on. She knew that once her clothing was removed, there would be no hiding the elaborate tattoo that covered most of her back. The intricate design told a story that would immediately identify her to anyone who understood its meaning, especially someone as knowledgeable about rebel organizations as Commander Thorne. The tattoo was not merely decorative. It was a mark of leadership within the resistance movement, indicating not just membership, but high rank and special responsibilities. The complex pattern of symbols and interconnected lines represented years of training, countless successful missions, and the trust of hundreds of fighters who looked to her for guidance and inspiration. As Maya slowly removed the gray uniform top, she could feel multiple sets of eyes watching her. The other prisoners were too focused on their own humiliation to pay much attention, but the guards were alert for any signs of weapons, contraband, or identifying marks that might be significant. Commander Thorne remained near the doorway, his expression unreadable as he supervised the proceedings. Maya's training had taught her to show no fear or weakness even in the most desperate circumstances. She forced herself to stand straight and move with deliberate calm, as if this degrading procedure was merely a minor inconvenience rather than a potential death sentence. Inside, however, her mind was racing through possible escape plans and emergency protocols. The moment her back was fully exposed, a collective gasp seemed to fill the room. Even the experienced guards had rarely seen anything like the masterpiece of ink that adorned Maya's skin from her shoulders down to her lower spine. The tattoo was clearly the work of a master artist, with fine details and perfect symmetry that spoke of patience, skill, and deep meaning. Commander Thorne stepped forward immediately, his eyes fixed on the elaborate design with obvious recognition. Maya felt his gaze like a physical weight as he moved closer to examine the tattoo more carefully. She knew that her carefully constructed cover identity was about to crumble, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her panic. The silence in the room stretched on for several long seconds as Thorne studied the markings on Maya's back. Other processing activities had completely stopped as guards and prisoners alike stared at the unexpected revelation. Finally, the commander spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but carried clearly in the sudden quiet. He announced that this prisoner would require special handling and immediately ordered her to be separated from the others. Additional security measures would be necessary, and he would personally oversee her interrogation. The casual efficiency of the processing procedure suddenly shifted into something much more serious and potentially deadly. Maya was quickly given back her uniform and escorted out of the main processing area by 4 heavily armed guards. As she was led away, she caught glimpses of the other prisoners watching her with expressions of confusion and fear. They had no idea what was happening, but they could sense that something significant had just occurred. Commander Thorne followed close behind as Maya was taken down a long corridor lined with steel doors. This part of the prison was clearly reserved for high-value prisoners or those requiring special security measures. The walls were thicker, the locks more complex, and the overall atmosphere more oppressive than the general population areas. They stopped at a reinforced door marked with warnings about dangerous prisoners and restricted access. One of the guards produced a set of special keys and began unlocking multiple deadbolts while another maintained a weapon trained on Maya. Even though she was still bound and surrounded by armed men, they were taking no chances with someone who bore the mark of a resistance leader. The cell beyond the door was small and stark, containing only a narrow metal bunk, a toilet, and a tiny sink. There were no windows, and the only light came from a fluorescent fixture protected by thick wire mesh. This was solitary confinement, designed to break down prisoners through isolation and sensory deprivation. As Maya was pushed inside, Commander Thorne paused in the doorway to deliver a final message. He told her that he knew exactly what her tattoo meant and what her presence here represented. The games and deception were over, and tomorrow they would begin discovering everything she knew about the resistance movement and its operations. The heavy door clanged shut behind her, leaving Maya alone in the dim cell with only her thoughts and the growing realization that her true battle was just beginning. Outside, she could hear the guards taking up positions and discussing additional security protocols. Commander Thorne's footsteps echoed down the corridor as he departed to plan his next moves. Maya sat on the narrow bunk and, finally, allowed herself to acknowledge the gravity of her situation. Her cover was blown, her identity was known, and she was now at the mercy of one of the most ruthless commanders in the government forces. But, even in this dark moment, she found strength in remembering why she had chosen this path, and the countless people who were counting on the resistance movement to continue fighting for freedom. The tattoo on her back represented more than just her own achievements and responsibilities. It was a symbol of hope for oppressed people throughout the territory, a sign that the spirit of rebellion could not be easily crushed by walls and guards and threats. Whatever happened to her in the coming days, that symbol would continue to inspire others to carry on the fight. As the lights in her cell dimmed for the night, Maya began to plan. She knew that escape would be nearly impossible given the enhanced security measures that would surely be implemented. But she also knew that the resistance had protocols for situations like this, and her capture might actually serve a larger strategic purpose if handled correctly. Tomorrow would bring interrogation, possibly torture, and certainly pressure to reveal information that could compromise the entire movement. But tonight, in the darkness of her solitary cell, Maya prepared herself mentally for the battles ahead. She had trained for this possibility, and she would not break easily regardless of what Commander Thorne had planned for her. Maya woke to the sound of metal boots echoing down the corridor outside her cell. She had managed only a few hours of restless sleep, her mind too active with escape plans and contingencies to find real rest. The fluorescent light above her head had never completely turned off, leaving everything in a perpetual gray twilight that made it impossible to track the passage of time. The footsteps stopped outside her door, followed by the distinct sound of multiple locks being disengaged. Maya sat up on her narrow bunk and prepared herself mentally for what was coming. She had been through interrogations before, but never as a captured leader with knowledge that could destroy the entire resistance movement. Commander Thorne entered the cell flanked by 2 guards, his uniform as crisp and perfect as it had been the day before. His cold blue eyes swept over Maya with calculating interest, As if she were a puzzle he was looking forward to solving. In his hand, he carried a thick folder that undoubtedly contained intelligence reports about the resistance and its operations. He gestured for Maya to stand and turn around, clearly wanting another look at the tattoo that had revealed her true identity. Maya complied slowly, refusing to show any sign of fear or submission despite her vulnerable position. The intricate design on her back told a story of years spent fighting for freedom, and she wore it with pride even in these circumstances. Thorn studied the tattoo for several long minutes, occasionally making notes in his folder. Maya could feel his eyes tracing the complex patterns and symbols that marked her as a high-ranking leader within the resistance movement. Each element of the design had specific meaning that would be clear to someone with his knowledge of rebel organizations. Finally, he spoke in a voice that was calm and conversational, almost friendly. He told Maya that he had been hunting resistance leaders for over 20 years, and he had never captured someone of her obvious importance alive. Her presence here represented a significant victory for government forces and a potential catastrophe for the rebellion. Maya remained silent, having learned long ago that saying nothing was often the best strategy during initial interrogation phases. Anything she said could be twisted and used against her or the movement, so her safest option was to provide no information at all. This approach often frustrated interrogators and sometimes led them to make mistakes. Thorn seemed unsurprised by her silence and continued speaking as if she had responded. He explained that they had been tracking her cell of rebels for months, gathering intelligence about their activities and planning the raid that had led to her capture. The attack on her mountain village had been specifically designed to flush out leadership figures like herself. The commander opened his folder and began reading from intelligence reports that contained disturbing amounts of accurate information about resistance operations. He knew about supply routes, safe houses, communication methods, and planned attacks with a level of detail that suggested the movement had been infiltrated by government agents. Maya listened with growing alarm as Thorn recited operational details that should have been known only to the most trusted resistance leaders. Either someone very high up in the organization was feeding information to the government, or their security protocols had been completely compromised in ways they had not imagined possible. Thorn noticed her reaction to the intelligence briefing and smiled coldly. He told her that the resistance movement was not as secure as its members believed, and that government forces had been several steps ahead of them for quite some time. Her capture was just the latest in a series of successful operations designed to dismantle the rebellion from within. The psychological pressure of this revelation was enormous, but Maya forced herself to remain outwardly calm. Part of her training had involved learning to compartmentalize information and emotions under extreme stress. Whatever damage had already been done to the movement, panicking would not help anyone and would only give Thorn more satisfaction. After allowing the implications of his intelligence briefing to sink in, Thorn shifted to a more direct approach. He told Maya that her cooperation could significantly reduce the suffering of her fellow rebels and potentially save many lives. The government was prepared to offer certain concessions in exchange for detailed information about resistance leadership and operations. Maya finally spoke for the first time since entering the cell, her voice steady and clear despite the circumstances. She told Thorn that he was wasting his time if he expected her to betray the cause she had spent her life serving. No amount of pressure or promises would convince her to compromise the safety of innocent people fighting for their freedom. Thorn nodded as if he had expected this response, and made another note in his folder. He explained that he had dealt with many idealistic rebels over the years, and they all eventually reached a point where continued resistance became too costly to maintain. The key was finding the right combination of pressure and incentives for each individual prisoner. He gestured to one of the guards, who produced a tablet computer and began showing Maya photographs that made her blood run cold. The images showed captured resistance fighters being held in various government facilities, many of them bearing obvious signs of interrogation and abuse. Some faces she recognized as people she had trained and worked with for years. Among the photographs was an image that hit Maya like a physical blow. It showed her younger brother Daniel, who had joined the resistance movement against her wishes only 6 months earlier. He looked thin and frightened, with fresh bruises visible on his face and arms. The knowledge that her own family was being used against her added a personal dimension to the interrogation that Thorne was clearly counting on. Thorne watched Maya's reaction to the photographs with obvious satisfaction. He explained that Daniel was being held in a facility known for its harsh conditions, and that his treatment would depend largely on his sister's willingness to cooperate with government authorities. This was a form of psychological torture designed to exploit natural human emotions and protective instincts. Maya felt a surge of rage that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. The idea of her innocent brother being tortured because of her activities was almost unbearable. But she also recognized this as a classic interrogation technique designed to cloud her judgment and make her more susceptible to making deals she would later regret. Fighting to control her emotions, Maya asked Thorne what specific information he was looking for. She made no commitment to provide anything, but she wanted to understand the full scope of what he expected from her. This knowledge might help her find ways to mislead him or provide useless information that seemed valuable on the surface. Thorne seemed pleased by this apparent willingness to engage and outlined his requirements in detail. He wanted complete organizational charts of the resistance leadership, including real names, locations, and communication methods. He also wanted information about planned operations, weapons caches, funding sources, and sympathetic civilians who provided support to the movement. Additionally, Thorne was particularly interested in learning about the significance of Maya's tattoo and the process by which resistance leaders earned the right to bear such marks. He suspected that the tattoo system represented a formal hierarchy that could be exploited to identify and target other high-value prisoners. Maya listened to his demands while calculating how much false or outdated information she could potentially provide without endangering current operations. Some of the organizational details he wanted were already compromised based on the intelligence he had displayed earlier, so confirming those facts might not cause additional damage. The interrogation continued for several hours as Thorne employed various psychological techniques designed to break down Maya's resistance. He alternated between friendly conversation and subtle threats, between appeals to her concern for fellow rebels and reminders of the hopelessness of her situation. At one point, Thorne brought in another prisoner who had allegedly agreed to cooperate with government forces in exchange for better treatment. The man looked familiar to Maya, though she could not immediately place him. He spoke about the futility of continued resistance and urged Maya to consider the practical benefits of cooperation over idealistic stubbornness. Maya suspected that this prisoner was either a government agent posing as a captured rebel or someone who had been completely broken by interrogation. Either way, his testimony was designed to make cooperation seem reasonable and resistance seem foolish. She responded by pointing out logical flaws in his arguments and questioning his motives for betraying his former comrades. Thorne dismissed the cooperative prisoner and returned to his direct approach. He spread photographs of captured rebels across a small table and asked Maya to identify them and provide information about their roles within the organization. When she refused, he began describing the interrogation methods that would be used on each person until she changed her mind. The descriptions of planned torture were detailed and graphic, designed to create vivid mental images that would haunt Maya's thoughts even after the interrogation ended. Thorne clearly understood that psychological pressure could often be more effective than physical abuse in breaking down a prisoner's will to resist. As the interrogation session stretched into its 6th hour, Maya found herself growing physically and mentally exhausted. The combination of sleeplessness, stress, and constant psychological pressure was beginning to take its toll. She could feel her concentration starting to slip, and her responses becoming less carefully controlled. Thorne noticed her fatigue and decided to end the session on a particularly cruel note. He showed Maya one final photograph that depicted her brother Daniel in what appeared to be a punishment cell, chained to a wall with obvious signs of recent beating. The message was clear: continued resistance would result in escalated abuse of people she cared about. Before leaving the cell, Thorne told Maya that she had 24 hours to consider his offer of cooperation. If she continued to refuse, the interrogation would escalate to include physical persuasion methods, and her brother's treatment would become significantly worse. He left behind a folder containing photographs of the captured rebels as a reminder of what was at stake. Alone again in her cell, Maya allowed herself a few moments of honest despair before beginning to plan her next moves. The situation was worse than she had imagined, with the resistance apparently compromised at multiple levels and innocent people suffering because of her capture. But giving up was not an option, regardless of the personal cost. She began to analyze everything Thorne had told her, looking for clues about the extent of government infiltration and ways she might be able to turn the situation to her advantage. Some of his intelligence seemed too detailed to have come from external surveillance, suggesting that there was indeed a high-level informant within the resistance movement. Maya also considered the possibility that some of the information Thorne had shared was deliberately false, designed to make her believe the situation was more hopeless than it actually was. Interrogators often exaggerated their knowledge and capabilities to intimidate prisoners into unnecessary cooperation. The photograph of her brother was particularly troubling, but Maya forced herself to examine it objectively for signs of manipulation or staging. While Daniel's distress appeared genuine, the timing and circumstances of the photograph raised questions about when and why it had been taken. As night fell outside the prison walls, Maya began to formulate a desperate plan that might allow her to protect the resistance movement while appearing to cooperate with Thorne's demands. It would require careful timing, convincing acting, and a willingness to sacrifice herself for the greater good of the cause. The plan was risky and had little chance of success, but it was better than simply surrendering all the information Thorne wanted. Maya had spent years preparing for the possibility that she might be captured, and she had always known that leadership came with the responsibility to protect others even at great personal cost. She spent the remaining hours before dawn refining her strategy and preparing herself mentally for what promised to be the most difficult performance of her life. Tomorrow, she would begin feeding Thorne carefully crafted lies mixed with just enough truth to maintain credibility while protecting the people and operations that mattered most. The tattoo on her back had marked her as a leader within the resistance movement, and now it was time to prove that she deserved that designation. Even in captivity, even facing torture and death, she would continue to fight for the freedom and safety of her people in whatever way remained possible. Maya closed her eyes and tried to rest before the next round of interrogation began. She knew that tomorrow would test every skill and principle she had developed during her years as a resistance fighter, and she was determined not to let her people down. The second day of interrogation began before dawn with the harsh sound of boots marching down the corridor. Maya had managed only fragments of sleep, her mind too focused on the dangerous game she was about to play with Commander Thorne. Today, she would begin implementing her desperate strategy to mislead him while appearing cooperative enough to protect her brother and fellow prisoners. When Thorne entered her cell this time, he was accompanied by a different set of guards and a woman in civilian clothes who carried recording equipment. The woman introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chun, a psychological specialist who would be observing and documenting the interrogation process. Her presence suggested that Thorne was taking this session much more seriously than the previous day. Maya studied Dr. Chun carefully, noting her calm professional demeanor and the way she positioned herself to observe both prisoner and interrogator. This woman would be looking for psychological tells and inconsistencies in Maya's responses, making it much more difficult to successfully lie without detection. Thorne wasted no time on pleasantries and immediately displayed new intelligence materials that made Maya's heart sink. He had photographs of resistance safe houses being raided, supply caches being discovered, and communication networks being dismantled. The scope of government operations suggested that the infiltration of the resistance movement was even more extensive than she had feared. However, as Maya examined the evidence more carefully, she began to notice patterns that gave her hope. Many of the operations being targeted were older ones that had already been abandoned or relocated. While the government clearly had good intelligence, much of it appeared to be outdated, suggesting that their source of information was not as current or comprehensive as Thorne wanted her to believe. This realization formed the foundation of Maya's deception strategy. She would provide Thorne with detailed information about resistance operations that had already been compromised or abandoned, while mixing in false details about current activities. This approach would make her cooperation seem valuable while actually protecting active operations. Thorne began the session by asking Maya to explain the meaning of specific symbols within her tattoo design. He had clearly researched the markings extensively and wanted to understand their significance within the resistance hierarchy. Maya saw this as an opportunity to begin her carefully planned deception. She explained that the tattoo represented a complex ranking system that had evolved over many years of underground activity. Different symbols indicated various specialties and levels of responsibility within the organization. However, Maya deliberately provided false information about what many of the symbols actually meant, hoping to confuse any government attempts to identify other tattooed leaders. Dr. Chin observed Maya's responses with professional interest, occasionally making notes about her body language and vocal patterns. Maya was aware that every gesture and tone of voice was being analyzed for signs of deception, so she worked hard to project the attitude of someone who was reluctantly, but genuinely cooperating. As the morning progressed, Thorne pressed for specific information about resistance leadership structure and communication protocols. Maya provided him with detailed organizational charts that appeared comprehensive but actually described the movement as it had existed months earlier, before recent security changes had been implemented. She named several resistance leaders who were already known to be compromised or who had been safely evacuated from the territory. This information would allow Thorne to claim intelligence victories without actually capturing anyone important. Maya hoped that these false successes would satisfy his superiors and reduce pressure for more aggressive interrogation methods. The most difficult part of Maya's deception involved providing false information about her brother Daniel and other captured rebels. She told Thorne that Daniel was merely a courier with limited knowledge of operations, when in fact he had been involved in planning several important missions. This lie was dangerous because it could be easily verified, but Maya gambled that Thorne would focus on higher-value targets first. Dr. Chun interrupted the questioning periodically to ask Maya about her motivations for joining the resistance movement and her feelings about the current situation. These psychological probes were designed to establish baseline patterns of truthfulness and emotional response that could later be used to detect deception. Maya answered these questions as honestly as possible, knowing that her genuine emotions would help sell the false information she was providing about operational details. She spoke about witnessing government oppression in her village, losing friends to arbitrary arrests, and feeling morally obligated to fight for justice and freedom. Around midday, Thorne introduced a new element to the interrogation that caught Maya completely off guard. He brought in a man she immediately recognized as Marcus Reed, someone she had believed to be dead for over a year. Marcus had been her mentor in the resistance movement and had supposedly died during a failed mission to destroy a government communications facility. Marcus was clearly alive, though he looked thin and worn from what had obviously been a lengthy captivity. More shocking than his survival was his apparent willingness to cooperate with government forces. He greeted Thorne respectfully and seemed genuinely concerned about Maya's welfare rather than angry about her capture. Thorne explained that Marcus had been working with government forces for several months, providing intelligence about resistance operations in exchange for improved conditions for captured rebels. This cooperation had allegedly saved many lives and reduced unnecessary suffering on both sides of the conflict. Maya felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Marcus had been more than a mentor to her. He had been like a father figure who had taught her everything she knew about leadership and strategy. The idea that he had betrayed the movement was almost incomprehensible, yet here he was, apparently healthy and content in captivity. Marcus spoke to Maya directly, his voice carrying the same warmth and authority she remembered from their years working together. He told her that continued resistance was futile and would only result in more suffering for innocent people. The government was prepared to offer reasonable terms for ending the rebellion, but only if key leaders like Maya were willing to negotiate honestly. Dr. Chin watched Maya's reaction to Marcus's presence with obvious interest. This was clearly a prepared psychological technique designed to exploit Maya's emotional attachments and trust relationships. The specialist was looking for signs that this approach might be more effective than traditional interrogation methods. Maya struggled to process the implications of Marcus's apparent betrayal while maintaining her composure under intense observation. If someone of his stature and commitment had genuinely switched sides, it suggested that the resistance movement was in much worse condition than she had realized. But she also considered the possibility that Marcus was being coerced or manipulated in ways that were not immediately obvious. Thorne allowed Maya several minutes to absorb this revelation before continuing with his questions. He asked her to confirm information that Marcus had already provided about resistance operations and leadership structure. This was a clever technique because it would be difficult for Maya to contradict someone she trusted without appearing stubborn or unreasonable. However, Maya noticed that some of the information Marcus was confirming contained subtle errors that the real Marcus would never have made. Details about people and events that he had been directly involved with were slightly wrong in ways that suggested either memory problems or deliberate deception. This gave Maya hope that her mentor had not actually betrayed the movement, but was playing his own deception game. The afternoon session became increasingly complex as Maya tried to navigate between multiple layers of potential deception. She had to maintain her own false cooperation while determining whether Marcus was genuinely working with the government or attempting to protect the resistance through his apparent collaboration. Thorne pressed for specific information about planned attacks and weapon locations, using Marcus's apparent cooperation to legitimize these requests. Maya provided carefully crafted responses that seemed detailed and valuable while actually revealing nothing that would endanger active operations. Dr. Chen interrupted again to ask Maya about her relationship with Marcus and whether she trusted his judgment about the futility of continued resistance. This line of questioning was designed to pressure Maya into accepting Marcus's advice to cooperate fully with government authorities. Maya responded that she respected Marcus greatly, but needed to make her own decisions about cooperation based on her understanding of current circumstances. She pointed out that conditions within the resistance movement had changed significantly since Marcus's capture, and information that had been true a year ago might no longer be relevant. This response clearly frustrated Thorne, who had expected Marcus's presence to quickly convince Maya to provide complete cooperation. Instead, she was carefully evaluating everything being presented to her and refusing to simply accept authority without question. As the interrogation continued, Maya began to detect patterns in the questions that suggested Thorne's intelligence was indeed incomplete and somewhat outdated. Many of his inquiries focused on operations and personnel that had been important months earlier, but were no longer central to resistance activities. She also noticed that Marcus seemed to be subtly signaling to her through his posture and word choices. These were communication techniques they had developed during their years working together, and his use of them suggested that he had not completely abandoned the resistance cause despite his apparent cooperation. The most telling moment came when Thorne asked for details about a weapons cache that Maya knew had been moved weeks earlier. Marcus confirmed the location that Maya provided, but he used a hand gesture that had always meant false information in their old communication system. This convinced Maya that her mentor was indeed playing a deception game of his own. With this realization, Maya began to adjust her strategy to coordinate with whatever plan Marcus was attempting to execute. She started providing information that appeared to contradict some of his statements, while actually supporting a more complex deception designed to mislead Thorne about current resistance capabilities. Dr. Chen noticed the subtle interactions between Maya and Marcus, but seemed unable to decode their meaning. Her psychological training had not prepared her for the sophisticated communication methods developed by experienced resistance fighters operating under extreme pressure. As the day's interrogation session neared its end, Thorne expressed frustration with what he saw as Maya's continued resistance despite overwhelming evidence that cooperation was in everyone's best interest. He warned her that further delay would result in escalated pressure and worsened conditions for the captured rebels she claimed to care about. Maya responded that she was genuinely trying to be helpful, but needed more time to process the complex information she was being asked to provide. She suggested that rushing through important intelligence matters might result in errors that could undermine the government's operations against remaining resistance cells. This reasonable-sounding request for more time was actually an attempt to delay providing critical information while hoping that resistance forces outside the prison might be able to mount some kind of rescue or disruption operation. Every day of delay increased the chances that her capture might not result in catastrophic damage to the movement. Before leaving her cell for the night, Thorne made it clear that his patience was limited and that the next day would bring much more direct methods of persuasion if Maya continued to provide incomplete cooperation. He also mentioned that her brother's conditions would deteriorate significantly if progress was not made soon. Marcus lingered for a moment after Thorne and Dr. Chun had left, ostensibly to make a final appeal for Maya's cooperation. However, he used this opportunity to convey crucial information through their secret communication system. He informed her that resistance forces were indeed planning a response to her capture, but she needed to maintain her deception for several more days to give them time to prepare. Alone again in her cell, Maya felt a mixture of relief and renewed determination. The knowledge that Marcus had not truly betrayed the movement and that rescue might be possible gave her strength to continue her dangerous game of deception. She also realized that her tattoo had become not just a mark of leadership, but a symbol of hope for everyone still fighting for freedom. The revelation about Marcus's true loyalties changed everything about Maya's situation, but it also raised the stakes considerably. If Thorne discovered that both prisoners were deceiving him, the consequences would be severe not just for them, but for all the captured rebels whose safety depended on maintaining the illusion of cooperation. The third day brought ominous changes to the prison routine that made Maya's blood run cold. Instead of the usual early morning interrogation session, she was left alone in her cell until nearly noon. When guards finally came for her, they were wearing full riot gear and carrying electric shock weapons. The atmosphere had shifted from psychological pressure to imminent physical threat. Maya was escorted through unfamiliar corridors to a section of the prison she had not seen before. The walls here were painted a stark white that somehow managed to seem more menacing than the institutional green of the regular cell blocks. Heavy soundproofing materials were visible around doorframes, and the air carried a faint smell of disinfectant mixed with something darker that Maya preferred not to identify. Commander Thorne was waiting in what appeared to be a medical examination room equipped with restraint tables and monitoring equipment. His expression was colder than ever, and Maya immediately understood that her carefully managed deception had reached its limits. Today would bring either breakthrough or catastrophe, with no middle ground remaining. Dr. Chun was also present, but her professional demeanor had been replaced by obvious unease about what was planned for this session. She carried a medical bag along with her recording equipment, suggesting that the interrogation would involve pharmaceutical assistance whether Maya consented or not. Thorne wasted no time explaining that he had lost patience with Maya's partial cooperation and incomplete information. Intelligence analysts had identified inconsistencies in her statements that proved she was still withholding crucial details about resistance operations. Today's session would employ more direct methods to extract the truth from her. Maya felt a surge of panic but forced herself to remain outwardly calm as guards strapped her to the examination table. The restraints were tight enough to prevent any movement while leaving her conscious and able to respond to questions. This was clearly a procedure that had been refined through extensive practice on other prisoners. Dr. Chin prepared a syringe filled with clear liquid that Thorne explained was a chemical compound designed to reduce psychological barriers to truthfulness. While not exactly a truth serum, the drug would make it extremely difficult for Maya to maintain complex deceptions under questioning. Her carefully constructed lies would crumble, revealing the real intelligence that Thorne desperately needed. As the needle approached her arm, Maya made a desperate decision to reveal part of the truth in hopes of preventing the injection. She told Thorne that Marcus had indeed been communicating with her through coded signals, and that much of the information she had provided was deliberately false. This confession was risky, but it might buy her time while Thorne processed the implications. Thorne immediately halted the injection procedure and demanded that Maya explain exactly how she and Marcus had been deceiving him. The anger in his voice was mixed with professional admiration for the sophisticated deception they had managed to maintain under intense scrutiny. He ordered guards to bring Marcus to the examination room immediately. When Marcus arrived under heavy escort, his eyes met Maya's with an expression that conveyed both pride in her courage and regret that their deception had been discovered. Thorne confronted him with Maya's confession about their secret communication, and Marcus made no attempt to deny the accusation. Instead, Marcus calmly explained that he had indeed been providing false information while pretending to cooperate with government forces. His apparent betrayal of the resistance movement had been an elaborate deception designed to protect actual operations while making Thorne believe he was gaining valuable intelligence. Thorne's rage at this revelation was frightening to witness. He had been manipulated by two prisoners for days, wasting time and resources while genuine resistance activities continued undetected. His professional reputation and personal pride had suffered a serious blow that would not be easily forgotten or forgiven. The commander ordered both prisoners to be restrained and prepared for enhanced interrogation involving both chemical and physical persuasion methods. Dr. Chun protested that such aggressive techniques violated established protocols, but Thorne overruled her objections with the authority of his position and the urgency of obtaining actionable intelligence. As guards prepared additional restraint equipment, Maya heard a sound that made her heart leap with hope. Somewhere in the distance, alarms were beginning to wail throughout the prison complex. The noise started as a single siren, but quickly escalated into a cacophony of warning signals that indicated a serious security breach. Thorne immediately grabbed a radio and began demanding status reports from various sections of the prison. The responses he received were fragmented and confused, but it became clear that multiple perimeter breaches were occurring simultaneously across the facility. This was not a random incident, but a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm security systems. Maya recognized the tactical pattern from resistance training manuals that she had helped write. This was a full-scale prison break operation, probably planned specifically to extract her and other high-value prisoners before they could be forced to reveal critical intelligence. The timing was perfect, arriving just as traditional interrogation methods were being abandoned in favor of more extreme measures. Explosions began echoing through the building as resistance fighters used demolition charges to breach walls and disable security systems. The lights flickered and went out for several seconds before emergency power restored partial illumination. In the confusion, Maya could hear gunfire and shouted orders as guards attempted to organize a defense against the unexpected attack. Thorne realized that his prized prisoners were about to be liberated and made a desperate decision to extract what intelligence he could before the rescue operation reached their location. He ordered Dr. Chun to proceed with the chemical injection regardless of protocols or safety concerns. However, as Dr. Chun moved toward Maya with the syringe, Marcus managed to break free from his restraints with a strength that surprised everyone in the room. Years of careful preparation had allowed him to slowly work loose the bindings during the confusion of the alarm situation. He tackled the doctor and sent the syringe flying across the room. Guards immediately moved to restrain Marcus again, but their attention was divided between the prisoners and the approaching sounds of combat in the corridors outside. Maya used this distraction to begin working on her own restraints, applying techniques that Marcus had taught her years earlier for escaping from various types of bonds. The door to the examination room suddenly exploded inward as resistance fighters breached the facility's inner defenses. Maya recognized several faces among the assault team, including her brother Daniel, who was clearly alive and unharmed despite the photographs that Thorne had used to manipulate her emotions. Daniel rushed to free Maya from the examination table while other fighters secured the room and neutralized the guards. The reunion was brief but emotional as Maya realized that the pictures of her brother's abuse had been fabricated to psychological pressure during interrogation. He had never actually been captured, but had been helping to plan her rescue from the moment her location was confirmed. Marcus was also freed from his restraints and immediately began coordinating with the rescue team about extraction routes and timing. It became clear that his months of apparent cooperation with government forces had actually been an intelligence-gathering operation designed to map the prison's security systems and identify the locations of captured resistance fighters. Commander Thorne had been disarmed and restrained, but his expression showed no fear despite his helpless position. Instead, he seemed almost impressed by the sophisticated deception that had been played against him. Even in defeat, his tactical mind was analyzing the operation and filing away lessons for future reference. Dr. Chun huddled in a corner of the room, clearly traumatized by the sudden violence and chaos that had erupted around her. Maya felt some sympathy for the woman, who had been trying to do her job professionally despite being drawn into increasingly questionable activities by Thorne's desperation for results. The rescue team leader informed Maya that they had approximately 10 minutes to evacuate the facility before government reinforcements arrived in overwhelming numbers. Multiple extraction routes had been prepared, and teams throughout the prison were simultaneously liberating other captured resistance fighters to create maximum confusion for pursuing forces. As they prepared to leave the examination room, Maya paused to look back at Commander Thorne one final time. She told him that the resistance movement was stronger than he realized, and that her capture had ultimately served to demonstrate the government's inability to break the spirit of people fighting for freedom and justice. Thorne responded that the war between them was far from over and that her escape would only intensify government efforts to crush the resistance movement permanently. However, his words carried less conviction than before, perhaps because he had learned to respect the capabilities of opponents he had previously underestimated. The extraction from the prison was a masterpiece of tactical planning and execution. Resistance fighters had studied the facility for months, identifying weaknesses in security systems and developing contingency plans for multiple scenarios. The operation proceeded with clockwork precision despite the chaos and confusion of the emergency situation. Maya and Marcus were evacuated through a tunnel system that had been secretly constructed over several weeks by resistance engineers. The tunnels connected to natural cave networks in the surrounding hills, providing multiple escape routes that would be difficult for government forces to track or intercept. As they emerged from underground into the pre-dawn darkness, Maya could see fires burning throughout the prison complex and hear the distant sounds of helicopter rotors approaching the facility. The rescue operation had succeeded, but it had also escalated the conflict to a new level of intensity that would have far-reaching consequences for both sides. During the evacuation through the mountain wilderness, Marcus explained how he had managed to deceive government interrogators for months while gathering intelligence about their operations. His apparent betrayal had been coordinated with resistance leadership from the beginning, though the psychological cost of maintaining such a deception had been enormous. Maya reflected on her own experience during the 3 days of captivity and realized how much she had learned about both enemy capabilities and her own strength under pressure. The tattoo on her back had initially exposed her identity and created terrible danger, but it had also served as a symbol of hope that had ultimately contributed to a successful rescue operation. The escape from Blackstone Prison became legendary within the resistance movement, inspiring fighters throughout the territory and demonstrating that even the government's most secure facilities could be breached by determined people fighting for their freedom. Maya's ordeal had ended, but her role as a leader in the struggle for justice was stronger than ever. As the rescue team reached a safe house deep in the mountains, Maya looked back toward the distant prison one final time. The experience had tested every aspect of her training and commitment, but she had survived without betraying the cause she served. The war would continue, but today belonged to the forces of freedom, and the symbol etched along her spine had proven its worth as a mark of true leadership.